See, you can tell when I procrastinate because the intro is nothing. Hello once again, friends and enemies. Welcome back to Card Game Review. My name is Toxy, and today we're going to be going over a card game that is kind of weird. Kind of not a card game that you would expect to find. That card game is Lightseekers. Lightseekers is an interesting card game that follows the moniker that Flesh and Blood does, where you have a hero card that represents you, and it's just kind of like an interesting game that has weird game mechanics that actually affect the position the card is in on your field. We'll talk about that later. Much like a few other more modern card games, Lightseekers have cards that you can actually scan into the online Lightseekers client, which is interesting to say the least. Lightseekers is also one of the few card games that doesn't have any card cost. Lightseekers is also the first game that I've ever seen that's actually a multiplayer game. Like you can play with up to multiple people. Like, of course, Magic is a multiplayer game, but Lightseekers actively has measures for playing with more than 2 people. Anyway, I don't really have much to say about Lightseekers. The game does have its own lore that you can follow. Personally speaking, I haven't. I picked this game up on a whim because it seemed fun, and it doesn't really interest me all that much, but that doesn't mean that I think the card game is bad. So I'm, of course, showing it off here. In that case, let's go ahead and take a look at the cards themselves. Lightseekers is a card game that is played with a deck made out of 30 action cards and 5 combo cards. For combo cards, you can only have 1 of each, but you can have up to 3 of each action card. The main card of your deck is going to be your hero card. Now, your hero card has elements that are going to determine the makeup of your deck. You can't play cards from your deck unless they fit an element that your hero can use. Your hero also has a health value, which will determine your health throughout the game, much like Flesh and Blood. Now let's take a look at the 2 types of cards that'll make up your main deck. Starting with action cards, you have a couple different types of action cards, but they all are kind of similar to each other. First, you've got attack and defense cards, you've got buff cards, and then you have item cards. The bottom of each action card will actually tell you what type of card it is, and at the top of attack, defense, and buff cards, it'll tell you the element that it is. The only outlier to action cards are the item cards that have the element in the middle of the card right above the text box, and down on the bottom left-hand corner of the card have a point value. Now, your hero can only have up to 2 points of items on them, so this point value will help you keep track of that. And the last type of card for the deck is combo card, which are, like, as they sound, giant cards that do a big combo. The very top of the card will have the elements much like most action cards, and the very bottom will tell you what type of card it is. Of course, much like action cards. Combo cards can come in attack, defense, or buff forms. Now let's move back to buff cards for a second to talk about the one thing that they have that's an outlier to the others, and that is these little circles up in the corners of the card. Now these circles vary depending on what type of buff card you're playing, but these circles will actually rotate your card every turn. The value in the circle will determine what happens based on the effect that the card has. Usually it's dealing damage. When the value is a number, of course the effect activates, but when the value is an X, that means you ignore the effect for that turn. Now when there are these little circles in the corner of buff cards, there are 2 types of corners that we need to pay attention to. The first one is a complete circle. This complete circle corner means that the card will rotate every single turn. However, if the circle is irregular and the edges of the circle are not perfectly circular, that means that the card only rotates whenever the effect of the card is triggered. When a buff card rotates to a point where the upper left-hand corner is blank, the buff card gets discarded. And there we have our incredibly basic layout for our cards. Probably the most basic that I've ever seen in a card game. So, let's take a look at the gameplay for a second. Here we have our Lightseekers playfield. We start with our deck face down, our hero card in the hero zone, and we have 4 cards in our starting hand if we're the first player. The second player will start with 5 cards in their hand, the third player will start with 6, and 4 and onward will start with 7. If we're playing with multiple people, the player to our left is our target and the player to our right is our enemy. If we're playing with just one person, they encompass both of these roles. If we are playing with multiple people, our goal in the game is to go after our target specifically. And before we move on, it's important to note that once our target is dealt with, once they have reached 0 health, we can move on to the next person to our left. So let's get into the gameplay. Players take their turns in a clockwise order. At the start of our turn, we activate any effects that specify the start of our turn. Moving from there, we go on to the buff phase, where we rotate any buffs that we have on the field, and if we're ready to discard a buff, we discard it. Moving from there, we go on to the action phase. During our action phase, we can choose to play up to 1 combo or up to 2 actions. To be a little more clear, one of the 2 actions that we can take is actually playing an action card. Another one that we can take is actually using an ability that is on a card that we already have in play. During our action phase, we can play Light Lasher, dealing 3 damage to our opponent's hero's health value. Once that card is done, we can put it in our discard pile, and then we can play a buff, Mage Ship. If we didn't want to do either of these, we could have instead played Solar Wind to deal 10 damage to our target. But for now, we're just going to stick with what we did before. Moving on from our action phase, we enter the draw phase, where we draw the top card of our deck into our hand. After that, we end our turn, where any end of turn effects will trigger. Once it gets back around to our turn, after the start of our turn, we can enter the buff phase and turn our buff card the way that the arrow in the corner is pointing. Once a player's hero reaches 0 health, their enemy, the player to their right, will gain a victory point, 5 additional health, and they can move 5 discarded cards back into their deck. If we're playing with just one opponent, they get this effect if we go down to 0 health. When the game gets down to only one player, that player receives 1 final victory point, and the player with the most victory points wins the game. And there you have Lightseekers. So, how do I feel about this game? Having played it, it's pretty fun. Overall, I think it's a fun game, but it's not a game that catches my attention, and it's definitely not the type of game that I would consistently come back to. I can definitely see a younger audience enjoying this game a lot more than an older audience, but if you don't like doing a lot of math and you are more akin to doing like a more simplistic, can be fast, can be slow type of card game, Lightseekers is definitely the game for you in my opinion. Price-wise, Lightseekers isn't that much as far as I've seen. I've seen booster boxes go for about $60. I've seen packs go for about the standard $3 to $4, and the decks can spend you about $10 to $20, just depending on how old the deck is, how rare it is, something like that. As for online clients, I haven't really looked into too much of that, but the Lightseekers official website does have an official online client that you can actually download to your phone or your computer if you'd like to play that way. Generally speaking, if you're interested in this card game, I definitely recommend playing it on the phone. I don't really know that many people that play the card game in real life. I'm sure that it has a community of its own. If it does, I haven't looked for it. And that's just perfectly my preference. Like, I haven't wanted to go looking for this community, mainly because I got this card game thinking it'd be fun, and not that it's not fun, it is fun, but it didn't really touch my brain, like I said before. So if you are an older person that's interested in this card game, I definitely recommend just downloading the app if you can, and just playing it that way. It's a lot more streamlined, and I think it would be a better experience for you. That being said, we mashed these things all together. I think personally I would rate this card game about, I want to say a 5.5 out of 10. I don't want to rate it low because it's not a bad card game. It's fun. Like I keep saying, I keep beating this into this video. The only problem that I have is that it just kind of feels like it would get really old really quickly. And it definitely doesn't feel like the type of card game you would play competitively, and it barely feels to me like a card game that personally I would play casually. I don't think I would. But there we go, a short card game review for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know down below how you feel about Lightseekers, the game, after seeing this video. And don't take my downplayed energy as anything like that. I'm trying not to be as loud so that the mic for the camera doesn't echo all of my voice all over. I'm trying to play around with the audio for the videos and make it sound a little bit cleaner. That being said, it is almost 2023 and hopefully I can get a lot more done in this next year. Until next time, drink your water.